Hello, everyone. We're going to get started with today's member-only webinar. This is Danielle Lamotte, Director of Professional Services with CSTD, and I'm very pleased to welcome you on behalf of the organization to today's session. I'm also pleased to introduce our speaker, Jim Clemmer. He's spoken quite extensively for CSTD in the past, offering conference sessions and workshops a bit across the country. And today he's going to talk about the strengths-based leadership revolution, which is based on some work that he's doing with Zenger Folkman. So without further ado, Jim, I'll let you take it away.
Thanks very much, Danielle. I am delighted to be here with hopefully recruiting a few rebels to the cause here of the strength-based leadership revolution. And I guess I'll start off with really identifying the need for doing things differently. Because when we take a look at just how critical an issue this is, we can start with this book. It summarizes a massive 10-year research study the consulting company McKinsey did, and they looked at a wide variety of topics around organizational health. But here's the one I think most relevant to our discussion today. They asked all of the participants, there were hundreds, thousands of them altogether in the survey, about leadership development. And of course, a large majority of them said that it really is important. But here's the real kicker. Only about 7% thought their organization was doing it effectively. So something's clearly got to change. This is not working very, very well when you take a look at what we see here. Now, the person that I think really incited the rebellion and then really wasn't perhaps followed as closely as he ought to have been. He's been followed in lots of other ways over the years, but that is the icon Peter Drucker. And Drucker, who you can see some of his credentials there, he's one of the most prolific management gurus around. But he made this comment way back in one of his early books, was written in the 60s, called The Effective Executive. And he talked about not being able to build performance based on weaknesses, that strengths is really all we can build on. And he goes on to even be stronger about that, to say that it's irresponsible and foolish to try to build on strengths or weaknesses. It's a misuse of human resources because it really is just a limitation for people. And unless, as we're going to talk about, unless it's something that really is a critical weakness, what we call a fatal flaw, we really need to focus on strengths. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. We're going to start with a little bit of background on the Zenger-Folkman relationship, as Danielle mentioned. It's a new relationship for us with the Clemmer Group, but it's what's old is new, because as we'll talk a bit about, Jack Zenger and I go back quite some time. And it's a bit like a city bus tour. A choice always in a session like this is whether to take a couple topics and go deep, or go a little broader across a number of topics. So I'm taking a broader overview, or I think of it like a city bus tour. My wife and I, Heather, love to travel, and a few years ago we were in Rome, and took a city bus tour as the first thing we do when we get to a city, get an overview, and then decide where we want to go and spend more time. So Rome, of course, is a city rich in history, layers of history, and while we won't quite be as deep as going through Rome here, the whole field of strength-based leadership is growing rapidly, and there's a lot of material to cover. We're going to touch the highlights. We're going to talk about the evidence-based approach. That was one of the things that really attracted me to what Zenger-Folkman has been doing. And within that discussion, we'll look at their research around the good, the bad, and the extraordinary leaders and those differences, how vast they are, and how significant they are for performance. We'll look at how do we then leverage leadership strengths. We'll get deeper into some of the comments like Drucker around the importance of looking at strengths versus weaknesses and what some of the research on that tells us. And then we'll look briefly at 360 assessment tools, where a lot of this data has come from, and there's a growing number of organizations using them today. We'll talk a bit about what are some of the components of the most effective ones. And then we'll move on to look at another key contribution that Zenger-Folkman makes to this growing field, which is cross-training or developing strengths. How do we develop strengths? And we'll briefly touch on that. And then we'll finish up with a few comments and a bit of research around reinforcing leadership development, how we really make sure that this takes hold. So it will be a quick overview, and after this session, we'll send out a follow-up survey with offer for you to make links to a number of different resources that we have available for you, the slides that I'm using, which I'm going to be moving through pretty quickly here. You may want to come back and take a look at some of them. So all of that will be available to you afterwards. So we'll get you on the bus, we'll get heading down the road, and when you get off to the first stop, you may want to spend more time there, but we're going to put you back on the bus again and head on down to the next stop. But we'll certainly send you more information around whatever area you'd like to perhaps come back to. So a bit of the background. Jack Zenger and I go back to actually 1981 when he was CEO of Zenger Miller. I was co-founder of a company called the Achieve Group. All of that has since gone on to become Achieve Global. But that's where Jack and I first began to work together, actually started a book together back in the early 90s, and for a wide variety of reasons never saw it through or completed it. And then we kind of went off in our own separate ways. And later into, I guess it was the early part of 2000, Jack reconnected with Joe Folkman when they were both at a company called Provant. And Provant had acquired Novations, where Joe was. And that began their relationship. And it also began then some of the work that we're going to be touching on today. So their first book together was called The Extraordinary Leader, and it came out in 2002. I actually reviewed it in my newsletter about a year later, thought it was an outstanding book. It really brought strong evidence to the field of leadership development. And they really used that book then to begin to build a strength-based leadership development system. Later on, they added The Inspiring Leader a few years later, closely followed by The Extraordinary Coach. And their most recent book that we're going to be drawing a fair bit from today, it just came out this past summer. In fact, was just reviewed in the Globe and Mail, a fairly large review last week. And it's called How to Be Exceptional. So we're really going to be drawing a fair bit from that. It summarizes very succinctly and in a surprisingly brief way what some of these key concepts and key approaches are. So that's a bit of the background and the history, and of course you can pick up any of those books if you want to get further into understanding what's been happening here over the last decade in the evolution and the development and the revolution of the strength-based field, or at least Zenger-Folkman's contribution to it. Here are some of the clients I've been working with over the last decade, some of them in Canada, most of them in the U.S., and a lot of the experiences and some of the data that I'm going to be showing you have come from some of those clients as well as more broadly across very large population groups. So why is Zenger-Folkman partnering with the Clemmer Group? It was one of those fortuitous things. Jack and I last spring reconnected on a client that I was working with, looking for some input from him on. And he started to say, we're looking for a partner in Canada. And we began a conversation which led us to where we are today. And so when we talked a bit about, well, why is it that he's interested in working with us? Well, they wanted to serve the Canadian market better. He and I have had a handshake partnership going back to those days of Zenger, Miller, and Achieve, starting way back over 30 years ago. And so he talks about being excited about having us and the synergy. Certainly, we've seen that already in the work that we've just been doing over the last couple of months. And so what really attracted us to working with Jack and his colleagues was Jack. And as we've gotten to know the other members of the team, they're very strong, great human beings, and very, very competent, effective individuals. The whole revolution of strength-based leadership, which I'm going to be talking a little bit more about shortly, has been very appealing to me, and I'll explain a bit more about why that is the case. And this need to bring evidence to leadership development, which is actually our very next section coming up shortly, was another appealing aspect of working with Zenger Folkman. And of course, the deeper philosophies of coaching, developing, growing leaders, very strong alignment, very strong synergy between our organizations, and a really strong fit with the work that we've been doing over the years around culture and leadership development. So that's a bit of background, a little bit of commentary on the bus before we get to our first stop. So let's stop at our first quick site here, which is this whole area of evidence-based leadership development. Now, I love the parallel with looking back at medicine and the field of medicine. Of course, back in the late 18th century, early part of the 20th century, we had all kinds of claims being made for all kinds of elixirs and potions, and actually literally was snake oil was one of the big ones at the time, and so you had snake oil salesmen. And you had all sorts of claims being made, completely unsubstantiated. And by 1906, the Food and Drug Act began to really regulate a lot of this. And so over the next 50, 60 years, more of a scientific approach was being brought into the field of medicine. But by the early 70s, when David Eddy, who is a physician, was asked to speak on how do physicians make decisions. What is the sort of approach? He wanted to build a decision tree for how physicians diagnose and then decide what treatment to use. And what he found when he went through that work was that it really wasn't anything to build the decision tree on. The way he states it, it was not a bedrock of evidence or formal analysis, but it was built on Jell-O. And now, though, over the last 40 years, there's been a major change in using evidence-based decision-making. And so today, we see a lot less reliance, as there was back then, on subjective judgments and much more use of evidence to be able to decide what treatment path. Well, that has led us to where we are today in medicine. We see this definition of evidence-based medicine, and any of you who are in the healthcare field who are joining us here today, you may well be familiar with this phrase, and it's becoming a major focus of a lot of what happens in healthcare. And none too late, we might all say. So it's more of a science-based approach. Well, I'd like to argue that we're 40 or 50 years back at the same level with leadership development. There are, if you were, as I did recently, if you go to Amazon and type the word leadership into their search engine, you'll come up with over 90,000 books that have that title, that word in the title. Big question is, well, how many more books? In fact, some of my leadership books don't have the word leadership in the title, but they're leadership books. So there's probably 2 or 3 or 4 times more than that available on leadership. If you type in leadership books into Google, you end up with 2.5 million hits. So there's all kinds of theories and opinions and thesis papers and frameworks and models around leadership. What we're missing is the evidence. So what is it that really works? And that is the first thing that really attracted me to what it is Zenger Folkman has been doing. So the original research base that Joe and Jack did back about 12 years ago now, and it took them a couple of years till they brought out their book in 2002, was they took a look at what is the impact of leadership performance with key behaviors, correlating that. And at that point, because of the work Joe had been doing, he's a psychometrician. Psychometrics has been his specialty for years, designing surveys, 360 tools, et cetera. And he had amassed at his previous company a massive database, 2,000 evaluations on 20,000 people over the last few decades. And so they began to really sift through that and look for what is the contrast between the highest performing 10% of leaders and the lowest performing 10%, and what can we learn from that to be able to identify which behaviors correlate with which outcomes. And so they identified 16 competencies that most set apart the extraordinary leaders from everybody else. And they also began to see this focus on strengths as being a major area that was beginning to emerge. So they were really some of the early pioneers in what is now a growing trend. So let's take a look at some of how they did this. It was, first of all, saying, well, leadership is not just about making improvement, just getting people to be better. It's about producing some kind of result. And so here's an example. This is a generic graph. You're going to be seeing more of these with real examples momentarily. But what they're essentially doing is just saying, all right, well, Group A being the lowest 10%, 10 percentile, Group B being the highest percentile, what are the major differences? And in a nutshell, what emerged, here's a very broad overview of the contrast. I mean, it's astounding differences. 4 to 6 times higher profitability amongst units, divisions, or branches run by extraordinary leaders. 6 times higher sales revenue. 10 to 20 times higher level of employee engagement. 3 to 4 times reduction in employees thinking about quitting. 50% fewer that actually do leave. Doubling the satisfaction with pay and security. I mean, that's the very same pay and security everybody's getting, but some people are twice as happy with it because of their leader. 4 to 5 times more employees willing to go the extra mile. 1.5 times higher. So you start to look at this and begin to see astounding differences, huge differences between the lowest percentile of leaders and the very highest percentile. And so that led them to then identifying these 16 competencies in 5 major groupings. And one of the things that they use is the leadership tent, which is to look at, so what are the major clusters here? And it's using the tent analogy with character as the center pole and these other 4 clusters around it. So in terms of detail, and again, this is one area you may want to come back and spend lots more time on, but here's a very quick look at, so focus on results takes in these 3 competencies. Personal capability takes in my own expertise, professional technical expertise, how I solve problems, innovation, and my self-development or growth. Leading change deals with the big picture, helping people see that. Building change and champions for change and helping people connect to that big picture. And then lastly is this so-called area of soft skills or interpersonal skills, which is around communication, has to do with, this one, by the way, correlates as the most significant of all of them, and their book, The Inspiring Leader, is built around this particular competency. And then around building relationships, developing others, and collaboration and teamwork. So that's a broad look at the competencies. For much more depth, you can look at either The Extraordinary Leader, the original book, which was updated in 2007, or the new book, which summarizes even more succinctly some of this work and really, I think, does a great job of taking it into the so what. So what do we do with all of this? So let's look then more specifically at that research. And I'm going to show you a couple of different charts. There's lots more of this sort of data that's available. It comes out of all different industries and different fields and different organizations. But here's a quick look at some of the data. And we're going to start, first of all, with the areas of employee engagement, satisfaction, commitment, because that's a huge one for many organizations these days. And lots of organizations are investing quite a bit, whether it's in pay, benefits, training, working conditions, schedules, childcare, on-site childcare, finding this elusive work-life balance, doing lots of things to try to increase levels of employee commitment, employee engagement. When Zenger-Folkman really looked deeply at this and applied all of that data and that evidence-based approach, they found one variable that emerged as the best predictor, a highly effective predictor of employee satisfaction and commitment, and that was, who is your immediate supervisor? That became the major variable. And so the effect of that we can see then on some of this data. So here's an example based on an aggregated study, 23,000 leaders in this study, and we see that the very lowest percentile of leaders in this study are ones where employee commitment is barely over the 20th percentile. And as we start to, so clearly they create dissatisfaction. We look at the next grouping. So now we start to see some improvement. It's stepping up, which is great. It's adequate. Now we get them to the 50th percentile, so that's certainly better than we saw at the beginning. But here's where we start to see those astounding changes. When we get up to the top of leadership, now we're getting up into the 70th and 80th percentiles. Some massive differences. Another study, this was a little bit smaller study, but it was looking at similar kinds of issues. And again, we see very similar sort of data. See in this particular one even more dramatic differences between the bottom and the top. So again, the data continues. You can take a look throughout a lot of the materials, or the links that we'll send you in the survey afterwards has a number of white papers that are available that brings a lot of this data around engagement or customer satisfaction, high levels of commitment, and this sort of summarizes some of what we're seeing. The blue line, thinking about quitting, and the data they have shows that those who think about quitting within 18 months, depending on the economy and the unemployment situation, actually do leave. So similar data on sales. I'm not going to go through all the details of this, but we see very similar kinds of trends where leaders at the top are dramatically higher in sales. Those of you concerned about health and safety, which is an area we do quite a bit of work in, building a safe culture, we see the very same kind of trend, that those at the bottom percentile of leadership effectiveness have very unsafe work environments versus those that are near the top or in the top percentile. We see dramatic difference, almost 3 times, well, over 3 times higher, more safer work environment than those at the bottom. Again, organizations pour all kinds of time and effort and money into organizational factors to improve safety when we really need to be looking at leadership. Here's data on turnover. And clearly we can see that extraordinary leaders have much higher retention rates, almost double the retention rates of those lesser leaders. Customer satisfaction. The connections, of course, are very strong. How can a dissatisfied, unhappy employee turn around and produce a satisfied customer? Well, it rarely happens. And so we see that connection clearly being shown in this data, that the most effective leaders do create much higher, much more effective, satisfied customers. Or looking at net income or profitability. Once again, we see, in this case, it was a large company with a group of mortgage banks where they were all quite equal, and it was easy to distinguish between high leadership and low leadership effectiveness and make this sort of correlation. So we see across the board these kinds of studies showing, this one I think is really interesting. Here's everybody in a population getting the same pay and job security, but feeling very differently about it. I look down at that bottom percentile and I think of the times I've run into people, and even in my own personal life, where I've said, well, I would never work, you couldn't pay me enough to work for that guy or that woman or that jerk. And so this really illustrates the truth of that. The same kind of data is available, we're not going to cover it here today, but is available around teams and looking at team effectiveness. They've developed competencies around teams, which we're now using as we do work at executive retreats and following up with teams. So all of this is saying we're really moving to an evolution or a revolution in soft skills development. This is taken from one of their white papers, one that Jack and Joe wrote called Leadership Development 6.0. It's one that we'll feature and make available for you after the session if you'd like to follow up and have a look at it. So the way we're going to handle today questions and comments is you should now be seeing, shortly you will be seeing, a window where, having just gone through this first section, are there any questions, comments that you might have that at the end of the webinar I'm going to come back and address? And I'll also throw one in here that I'd be interested in your perspectives on as well. We're not going to be able to individually answer each one of these, but Danielle and I will pull out in the last few minutes of our webinar some of the key themes and comments. So when you look at all of this research we've just gone through and whizzed by, and now we're jumping back on the bus to get to our next stop, how would evidence-based, how would this kind of approach really revolutionize your leadership and development work? Be interested in your perspectives on that. Okay, so let's go on to take a look then at what do we do then with leveraging leadership strengths, and what's the importance of using strengths and focusing on strengths. This really starts to get at one of the other key elements of Zenger-Folkman's findings and approach. So let's come back and blend together the sage advice and wisdom of Peter Drucker with more of the modern research that's been emerging. So if we come back to Peter's work, he goes on in that, it's really elaborating more on that opening comment that I used of his, to say that what the effective executives do is they make strengths productive. And Drucker goes on to argue that we can't really build on weaknesses, that it's strengths that are the true opportunity, and that is the unique purpose of the organization. And so how do you overcome weaknesses? Well, it's to try to make them irrelevant, not to focus on them as such and try to fix them. So that's what he sees as the purpose of strong, effective organizations, is to feed those opportunities and starve the problems. Well, this was in the 60s he was saying this, and he wasn't getting a lot of traction back then. But now we're beginning to see a lot more research, a lot more evidence, a lot more convergence of work that begins to really show just how prescient he was. Appreciative inquiry is one example, where David Koppenreiter and his colleague here, Diana Whitney, took a look at the results of some of the biggest surveys they've done on managing change. And what they found was that most organizations have this kind of unwritten rule, which is to focus on what's wrong and let the strengths take care of themselves. It's a bit like the kid that comes home with a report card of a bunch of B's and a C and maybe a few A's, and what is it that we tend to focus on right away? What's with that C? Rather than, well, how can we help those B's become A's? How can we help build, increase those strengths, which will probably pull up the C as well? But if we focus just on the C, that's quite a different and unfortunately traditional approach. So in the work of appreciative inquiry, which some of you may be involved in using, it's searching for the best in the organizations and figuring out what is it that gives life to the organization and community, and how can we build on that? How can we strengthen that? How can we reinforce and leverage off of that? Or another area, and it was the area that I've been deep in for a long time, is positive psychology. Martin Seligman's work, this is one of his earlier books in the area of positive psychology, where he talks about the movement that he's been spearheading to move away from the sickness model of psychology to fix illnesses and problems and diagnostic handbook of what's wrong with people, which of course we still need, and certainly a place for that, but we also need as a counterbalance focusing in on what's right and how we can get more of that, how we can build on that, how we can strengthen and reinforce that. And in his most recent book called Flourish, he uses a very similar scientific kind of approach to what I see with Zenger-Folkman and is bringing strong evidence to this whole field. Well, I want to just step back for a minute here and talk about a story, tell a story of focusing on strengths. This is a story of a 7th grade teacher who years ago, maybe she was one of the sort of intuitive pioneers of what's now positive psychology and gratitude approaches that are now being used. But she gave an exercise to her grade 7 kids in positive feedback. She circulated a blank page with the name of each student on the top, and she asked them then to write a positive or a strength on each of those pages about that student. So they circulated that around the room, and then she gave that page to each of the students to take away. Well, years later, she had got word that one of her students had joined the Marines and was killed in action. So she went to the funeral, and a pallbearer there remembered her, I guess was maybe a classmate as well, and the parents overheard their conversation. And the conversation was about how he had carried this piece of paper till it was ragged in his wallet and was actually found on him, on his body. I think that's a powerful example of what is it that really is meaningful to us. It's a sense of purpose, meaning, strength, reinforcement. It's positives that ultimately can really have significant impacts on our lives. So here's the question. What if the teacher had asked them to write developmental suggestions to each other as a way to improve and as a way to help each other get better? I think the story would have had quite a different outcome. Well, here's a question that if we were together in person and had more chat time, we would get into maybe why is it that we tend to focus on fixing weaknesses. I think that it's deeply embedded in society. It's embedded in child rearing and parenting. It's embedded in the education system. It's embedded in performance management and appraisals approaches. So, for example, why do most performance reviews focus on fixing weaknesses rather than leveraging strengths? Why is it that performance reviews are something people tend to look toward with apprehension, with dread, or the way you can maybe send chills up somebody's spine is to say, I'd like to give you a little feedback? Because we tend to see all of this as zeroing in on what's wrong and fixing the problems. And so what's the lingering effect of that? Well, typically what that does is it helps build a culture of defensiveness and searching for what's wrong. There's often lots of data denial and arguing with the data and a sense of, well, that's just their perception. That's not reality. I'm sure some of you have heard that one before. Participants too often when they do go through 360 survey or feedback process, most of them are quite negative. Most of them are looking at what's wrong. I know of a few clients where they just have had horrible experiences with using those sort of tools. And so there's a real avoidance of them. The overall culture of recognition and appreciation is dramatically eroded. And the positivity ratio, something Barbara Fredrickson, one of the positive psychology psychologists, in a book called Positivity, has identified the critical importance of a positivity ratio in organization teams and in our personal lives, and that anywhere from 3 to 6 to 1 is the ideal positivity ratio. So here's another interesting thing which we're going to look at momentarily in the Zenger-Folkman research is that working on weaknesses really just gets us to average. It doesn't really take us to extraordinary. We do want to work on it. Both approaches can, of course, produce results. and at times working on what's wrong, especially if it turns out to be a fatal flaw. There's a weakness there that's clearly getting in the way. We need to focus on that. But if people do want to take a weakness-based approach, and it's something that will get them working on it, well, then obviously we don't want to get in the way. But what we're really doing here, as Michelangelo talked about, is making sure that we aim higher than just let's fix a problem. Let's aim at really focusing on our strengths. And when we look back at the research on, now we're looking at the middle of those charts to the top of the charts, what you see here is consistently almost always a doubling or a cutting in half of many of these performance indicators going from just good. So these are good managers who now become great managers. We double, most cases, their effectiveness by taking a good manager and helping them become a great manager. So that is building on strengths. And as we get into this section on building on strengths, we'll take a look at, so what is it then that takes us there, and how do we define building on strengths? Well, it tends to be those areas that are most highly valued in cultures. We develop it through focused efforts. It can be found in multiple leaders. It is what separates the highest performing from the lowest performing. And it's the only way to become an exceptional leader. So as you step back and you think about maybe leaders that you've known, what are the, have they had any weaknesses? Well, of course they have. Every leader has some kind of weakness. Were they above average on some competencies? Well, most of them were, if they were one of the best leaders you've known. And did they possess some profound strength? Well, typically they did. So as we look then at how this whole area, and there's lots more that we can cover in this area of leveraging strengths, how would this have an impact for your organization? What would be some of the ways that focusing in on strengths would really help you move from good to great? What difference would it make in building in your organization? And what we're going to look at here momentarily is how we don't have to be a superhero to build on strengths. It is an area that, and here's where the counterintuitive part starts to come in, that just focusing on a couple of strengths can have a profound impact on perceived performance. So again, we'll get back on the bus. What are some comments? What are some questions that you might have around leveraging leadership strengths? And I'd be interested in your perspective on how would this revolutionize your own leadership development work. So let's move on then to our next stop, which is a quick look at 360s and the use of 360s and what has come out of the research and best practices on 360s. Well, one of the reasons that many organizations today are moving to 360s is because we're finding more and more that self-perceptions aren't anywhere nearly as accurate as others' perceptions. So for example, in driving, I've seen various studies now that have shown anywhere between 75 to 85% of us rate ourselves as above average drivers, which of course is statistically impossible. And so Zenger-Folkman has found that self-perceptions of effectiveness are only half as accurate and half as predictive of outcomes as is others' perception of us. And so it's research like that that has organizations using 360 tools. So 85% of Fortune 500, I'm sure many people on this call are using 360 tools. It can have a major impact on awareness and development, but the big issue is if we're using them in a weakness-based approach, what's continually found is participants don't tend to enjoy the process. There isn't a lot that tends to change that comes from it. We're really losing 70 to 80% of the training value because, as you'll see here momentarily, that's where we get the highest leverage in building, taking strengths from 75th percentile to the 90th percentile. And it tends to be seen as very negative and punishing. So what's been found is that when we help leaders work on strengths, unless again, of course, they have a fatal flaw, and just over a quarter of the time that is the case, but that means about 75% of the time that's not the case. So when we're working on strengths, leaders tend to create much better development plans. Their overall leadership effectiveness often is 2 to 3 times higher. They improve specific issues much more effectively. They give more time to development, and they put in much more of a concerted effort. So what are some of the components of a best-of-class assessment? Well, here's where I, again, will be happy to send you a white paper, because this is a very quick summary, some of which we've covered. It's a bit of a review and a preview, because it's a review of some of the points we've made and a preview of a few that we have left to cover. So that we need something that's predictive, and the data that we've just seen is highly predictive. We need to look at extraordinary leadership, not just averages. So it's not just a case of, gee, we've passed, which can create false positives, a sense of, oh, well, I don't really need to worry about this because I'm doing okay. But we really want to get people to move from okay to outstanding. So how do we do that? It's through leveraging strengths. We need to measure against key performance outcomes, and some of this we have been covering here. And then as we look ahead, we're going to look at the point 9 particularly. What are some ways to leverage a strength? Because linear development is typically not effective. We need what we call nonlinear or cross-training as a way of leveraging our strengths. So again, that was a very quick look, quick stop at what can be a deep topic area. Well, what's some of your experience with using 360s? What have you found are some of the biggest problems or opportunities, or there's some particular questions and areas that you'd like to look at? So we'll take a look now at this area I've been talking to about cross-training, or what really is a revolutionary approach to developing strengths. And then here's where it gets most counterintuitive. And I have to say, frankly, it took me a while to get my head around this concept. But as I did, and as I began to see the power of cross-training and saw it being applied with leaders and organizations, it really is incredibly valuable, the revolutionary approach that can be highly effective. So it's, we said it's what differentiates, strengths are what differentiate, and that we don't develop a strength the same way that we fix a weakness. And there's times when we do have to focus on fixing a weakness. What happens here, and what happened was, one day as Joe and Jack were working and looking at all this data, Joe came into Jack's office and he said, look at this interesting relationship between a couple of these competencies. So for example, what he found was that if a leader builds relationships as a strength, but doesn't have drive for results as a strength, that the probability of being overall rated as an extraordinary leader is only 12%. And then the flip side was, if driving for results was a strength, but building relationships was not, the unfortunately all too common example of get results but leaving a bunch of dead bodies in your wake, then the probability of being extraordinary is only about 14%. It's not much different. And so when we look at this combined, you would tend to say, well, if we've got both of these together, if you've got a leader that does both of these, if you're familiar with the work of Jim Collins, he talks about how the great companies, the good to great, the great companies, great leaders, level 5 leaders, don't succumb to the tyranny of the or. They don't look at this and say, well, which do you want? Do you want relationships or do you want results? They recognize that it's about doing both. So you look at this and there'd be a tendency to think, well, if we add these two scores together, that somebody who's good at both of these probably then has about a 26% probability of being an extraordinary leader. In fact, what the research has shown time and again is that it's actually 72%. You can't see that too well on there. But combining the two together dramatically increases the odds of this person being seen as an extraordinary leader. So that takes us into some of the research, for example, that building a strength, taking just someone who has no strengths but no weaknesses, if they build one strength, they can double. They can go from 30th percentile to 60th percentile in being seen as an extraordinary leader. So how do you do that? Well, traditional linear development, which is learning skills, taking classes, reading books, mentoring, practicing skills, getting coaching, feedback, that might help to some extent. It certainly helps with weakness, or maybe helps someone go from average to maybe a bit above average, but it does not help take someone from good to great. So there's a totally new view of competencies and building competencies that's emerged out of all of this. It's not like a coil spring where they're highly independent of each other. There are these statistical relationships, one of which I've just shown you, between two competencies that Joe first saw, and that when we score high on one, we often tend to pull, like a giant tent pole, the others with it. So it explains the need for having a balanced tent and having competencies in a number of these other areas. So when we look at cross-training, the term is drawn from the world of athletics and sports and long-distance running, for example. The best thing is to build around them. So an example would be to say, well, a typical long-distance runner, and if you want to be a long-distance runner, well, if I'm not a runner at all, just getting off the couch and going from terrible to bad might be the place to begin. But if I'm now starting to run, how do I go from being a novice to an intermediate? Well, linear training. I would run more. I would increase distance, build endurance. But now, how do I go to an advanced level runner? Well, that's where cross-training comes in. So cross-training, for example, would be a series of these kinds of activities that it's not just go out and run more, because I get to a point where if I run too much in preparation, I'll actually do myself more damage than good. I need to build interlocking or counter strengths or exercises or kinds of activities that will take me from good to great. So how does that apply to leadership? Well, the same kinds of correlations were identified across each of the competencies, and I'll just show you one example here. So if someone is pretty good at high integrity and honesty and wants to take that one even higher, here are some of the examples of cross-training competencies that would go with that. So looking at picking maybe 2 or 3 of those that I have a passion about, that I feel that I can really leverage further, and getting better at them. Another quick example, someone who wants to be perhaps stronger in technical skills. And the Competency Companion Development Guide, which is what CCDG stands for, is where this material has been pulled together. And so here's another set of statistical relationships showing people who are seen as extraordinary in that particular skill set have these other relationships. And so what we can do is focus in on or identify a couple of these other competencies to work on. One last quick example might be around communication. So for example, we see strategic perspective there. Well, communication isn't just about getting together more often or sending more emails or having more meetings, or even the skill of communication. It might mean that I need to communicate the bigger picture more effectively, or I need to translate messages to fit, or I need to involve others as a way of being seen as being a better communicator. So once again, I'll come back and ask you, For any comments, questions around cross-training, it's an area I've covered very quickly here, but it did take some time to get your head around it, but it's a very powerful and revolutionary concept when you really start to get deep into it. So how would that revolutionize perhaps your approaches to learning and development? All right, well, we get back on the bus for one last short stop, which is some of the research around reinforcing leadership development. So far we've talked about different ways to develop leaders, where to focus, approaches for leadership development. How do we make sure it sticks? How do we make sure that it really connects? Well, again, a lot of interesting research. This one has lots of implications for all of us in the learning and development field. This is looking across, and there's numerous studies, again, Zenger-Folkman has. This has 5,000 leaders in it and aggregated 5 studies. And what they've consistently found is that between 3 levels of management, there's roughly a 14.5% percentile difference in leadership effectiveness. So part of what you can take out of this is say, well, the cream rises to the top. The leaders at the top of organizations tend to be seen as the most effective leaders overall, consistently, and on down through to the lower levels of the organization. But the other thing that we can take out of this is to say that if we want to increase leadership levels, but we don't change this ratio, then we clearly need to move senior managers up much higher in order to pull everybody else up. That's one approach. Or what was also found was that some organizations, it's the rare ones and it's the more effective ones, actually have a much smaller gap between the levels, and it can get as low as 4.5 percentile difference between each one, the percentile points. And so what is it that makes a difference for them? Well, they've tended to set the leadership bar pretty high to begin with. They're much more rigorous in their selection of leaders. They tend to build talent management processes around leadership competencies more effectively, and they have really made it line management's responsibility to develop people. So those 2 slides themselves have lots of implications and can make for interesting conversations with executives and with leadership, learning development professionals around how we close that gap, or how, in many ways, senior executives set the leadership ceiling for the organization. If we want to increase leadership overall, we need to move that ceiling up higher and or close the gap. Well, let's go on to another part of this discussion then, which is looking at the impact of management support on development efforts. Numerous studies over the years have emerged showing similar kinds of data to what we see here, which is that the percentage of leaders who feel that they've improved dramatically increases based on what sort of support they are getting from their managers. Here's another example that Marshall Goldsmith and a colleague of his did on where there was no follow-up. We see the perception of change. It's all hanging in around the 0. There's a little change in the 1 and 2 and a bit in 3, but we also see some falling back on the other side. So it's slightly biased towards 0 and 1, but where we see consistent or periodic follow-up, we see a dramatic shift in the sort of change, perceived change in effectiveness. Or another study here looks at where there was no follow-up. We saw, again, a similar pattern, not a lot of change. Where there was dramatic follow-up, very similar, same kind of pattern that takes place. So clearly follow-up is critical, and Zenger-Folkman, in fact, has found that roughly 87% of what a person learns in a leadership program is gone within 30 days if there is no follow-up. So our last stop, as we now are going to get back on the bus and have discussion, I guess, on our way back to getting back home again. So thoughts you might have on this last section we just looked at around follow-up and support and follow-through. And what follow-up have you found is the most effective in making leadership development stick in your efforts? Well, just before we start to pull back now and take a look at what questions have come in, thoughts, comments, responses, etc., I'll just close with a quick review then of what we think the Zenger-Folkman sort of approach has really added to this new and growing field of strength-based leadership. There's a lot more rigorous analysis. That's the evidence that we talked about earlier. Studies really confirm that strengths aren't fixed, that they can be developed. We went over that fairly quickly, but there's a lot of research to show that we can develop strengths, and it's using nonlinear sorts of approaches that develops that strength. There's some studies Zenger-Folkman has done where they actually looked at people who focused on fixing weaknesses versus those who focused on fixing strengths, and the focusing on strengths was 2 to 3 times more effective than focusing on weaknesses. And really, when we go then from good to great, what takes people from the 75th percentile to the 90th percentile, from a strength to a profound strength, the only way that has been identified now in all these hundreds of thousands of people in this study is using a strength-based approach that uses that nonlinear or cross-training method. So we will be following up from today's webinar with an email survey, and it'll be a chance to win a couple of signed copies. I actually have signed copies by all 4 authors of the book. So we'll do a draw for a couple of signed copies of the book for those who complete the survey. There'll also be there then a number of links to white papers, articles, blogs that some I've mentioned here today. There's lots more that are available. We can give you a copy of today's slides for this webinar that you might want to look again or show others. And there's also information on a briefing or panel. Those of you in the Toronto area, if you'll be in Toronto, October 25th, we have a number of clients who are using this approach on a panel and an overall briefing, and it's complimentary. And there are also some public workshops coming up in Calgary and Toronto, which we can send you information. So thanks for joining our city tour. Hopefully you got a few pictures along the way. And there is lots more information available on all of this at our website, our Leadership Resource Center. I'm always happy to talk with you by phone or by email further about any of this. And hopefully you got much more than you paid for here on this tour. And at this point, we'll now step back and maybe, Danielle, if there are any overall trends that you've noticed or questions that have emerged, this is a time when we can pull back and look at some of this.
Yeah, sure. So I'll just start with the first question, which was the how would an evidence-based approach to leadership development revolutionize your industry, I think, or your organization was the question.
Yeah, your learning and development work.
Yeah, your learning and development work. Sorry, I had to scroll down there. So Christy wanted to know what the top 3 competencies for the exceptional leader are, if you could talk a bit about that.
Well, that's an interesting one. The only one that came up as a top competency and was named consistently was the one inspires and motivates others. The others really don't come up in any particular rank order. And what's found is, for example, developing 3 of the 16 competencies and taking them from good to great. So if I get my feedback report and I see that there are 3 areas that I'm pretty good at, and chances are I'm probably pretty passionate and enjoy those areas, if I can move those to profound strengths, I will change my perception of leadership from somewhere around the 35th percentile to the 80th percentile. I mean, it's astounding. It's that tent-pole effect that will dramatically, and it doesn't matter which 3 it is. Now, the inspiring and motivating others is the one that most consistently comes up as people wanting more of. But it doesn't have to be that one. It can be any 3 of the 16 will dramatically change my perception of leadership.
Okay, and Melody also wondered how, with this kind of type of data being available, how are organizations responding, and are you seeing an increase in the number of organizations that are actually doing something about developing their leaders?
Well, we're just getting into this relationship with Zenger-Folkman. So
Mm-hmm.
I came from a client conference. Zenger-Folkman are based in Utah, and so we have an annual client conference at the Sundance Ranch in Utah, which is Robert Redford's ranch,
Mm.
very nice place. And so I was there this summer, and there were a number of clients from large organizations, General Foods, Wells Fargo Bank, Elsevier. There was a few others, and they're slipping my mind right now. But and one from Mexico, a big theater chain in Mexico, and they were talking about dramatic changes and improvements in their leadership development activities and effectiveness. Here in Canada, at our client panel in October in Toronto, we are going to have some clients from Canadian Tire who've been parts of the Canadian Tire have been using this now for a couple of years, from Fanshawe College in London, Niagara region, the municipality, and possibly Ellis Dawn, the construction company as well. We've had an individual here, Zenger-Folkman has had an individual here who we're delighted to link up with now. His name is Ed Haltrick, and Ed has been delivering this material for the last number of years in Canada, and pretty dramatic results along the lines of what we've talked about here that Ed will be talking to and some of these clients will be talking to at the briefing.
Okay, and Lewis had a question of when you're talking about the notion of not fixing weaknesses, how does development fit into that idea?
Well, there's really, I guess our choices are when we're looking at how we develop people. Uh, Typically, the word development or improvement has a sort of unconscious, I think, bias or roots in saying, well, the way I improve is to get better at something I'm not very good at. We've tended to see that or make that sort of equation. And it goes back to the comments I made about grades in school and lots of things that are built into our system in that way. And so our choices really are, when we're looking at ways to improve, is to zero in on something that we want to get better at. Now, if it's a fatal flaw, if it's something where no one can see past it because it's just blaring so loud, I've got to deal with it. There's just no other focusing on strengths or any of that sort of thing is not going to be very effective, and so I've got to deal with it. But if I've now dealt with it, or I'm one of the 70, almost 75% who don't have a fatal flaw, then my choice is, what do I work on? And there's an interesting grid, which we didn't have time here to cover today, that looks at the organizational need. And so some of what comes back from the Zenger-Folkman 360 approach is getting all input from your boss, from peers, from direct reports around the 16 competencies. Which four, and that could come back a bit to Christy's question about which three are the most important, because ultimately what matters is which are the most important to that individual in that role. And so in this case, we ask for four. What are the four most important competencies for this role? And then that gets overlaid with what are my passions, which usually are in some way connected to my strengths, which is the third area. So when I look at those three on a grid, I can start to make choices about what is it that I'm going to work on. Now, if I'm, let's say, a supervisor, a frontline supervisor, chances are that strategic perspective is not going to come up very high, either on what others say I ought to work on or what I might feel that I want to work on. But if I'm a CEO, I may not be very good at that, and it may come up fairly high, or that may be somewhat of a strength, and now I want to take it further. So it's a little bit of that art and science of figuring out what it is that I want to focus in on and work on for my development.
Okay, and Tim had a question about how his perception was that the research and the outcomes favored private sector leaders, and he wondered how that data might compare for public sector organizations, and if you had a thought about that.
Sure. A lot of the data is private sector, no question about that. Here in Canada, and Ed, I mentioned Ed Haltrack. He actually teaches a course in psychometrics at York University, and he has been doing research here in Canada and has been working with some of the public sector firms I mentioned, Niagara Region, Fanshawe College, and there's a couple of others that he's working with as well. And so he's beginning to collect more of that data. But ultimately there, what the performance outcomes are probably going to be more focused on things like engagement, satisfaction with pay, um, turnover. So things like sales aren't going to matter, or profitability isn't going to matter, but there's lots of the other outcomes that are going to be quite relevant, whether it's private or public sector.
Okay, and Jennifer's got a question. It's a bit of a long one, so I don't know if we'll be able to address all of it, but she's talking about how they're trying to shift their culture by focusing on a strengths-based approach, but they have strong subculture of labor relations and some history of labor disruption. So she was interested in the survey work, and when things are bad, there's an absence in leadership, and what causes may this represent? And is it that there's another leader or conflicting leaders in the group?
Okay. That's a little, that one gets more specific, so it's a little hard to answer
Yeah, it's a little
knowing the specifics of the situation. I guess as a general answer, I would say that some of my earlier work, well, my most recent book was had a model where we talk about lead, follow, or wallow as being some of the basic choices, and the kinds of cultures that we build where people feel that everybody's a leader, we all need to move forward and make things happen, or we sit back and wait for somebody else, or we wallow in negativity and so forth. And so sometimes in a conflicted culture, such as where there are real labor management issues, the challenge is helping people to focus on what's right, to focus on moving forward, to look to the future and not get stuck in the past. Those are all key leadership skills. And if individuals in that kind of culture were going through this sort of process, they would probably identify things like leading change, some of the competencies around leading change, or potentially around interpersonal skills and how we influence others and try to change that perspective would likely be an area that they would need to be even better at and try to make a real strength out of it.
Okay, and then I think it's about 5 after 2, but if you've got a few more minutes, we can work through some of these other questions.
I'm fine, sure.
Okay, so then on the 360 problems and opportunities, Diane mentions that she really likes the 15-minute completion because she seems to find that they're quite lengthy, and that because of that you tend not to get such great feedback. And Jennifer highlighted a similar problem in that it takes time to coach respondents so that they're accurate and clear. And the individuals need to respond focusing on what they need and own their comments and ranking, making it, giving you something that you can use as an evidence base, and the fear of candid feedback, and also the idea that some people just don't buy into the concept of it, and then they don't want to hear that feedback from their supervisors or followers or both, and they're defending themselves before the survey's even started.
Yeah. Well, that last comment is very indicative and I think symptomatic of a weakness-based culture and a weakness-based approach. And the very reason that a lot of people don't like 360s is because it tends to be what's wrong and here's how we're going to fix you. And most of us don't really appreciate that kind of approach very much. So getting a focus on strength and getting people to understand that this is not looking for what's wrong. If there is something glaringly wrong, yes, we're not going to overlook it or pretend it's not there or try to wish it away. We're going to deal with it. But our search and our bias is really towards what's right and how can we make it even better or leverage it even more to move forward. Some of the other parts of that comment, I'm not sure what else might be working in the culture that may be getting people concerned about 360s. But certainly one of the things that we see with 360s generally is they tend to be way too long, way too complex, and they drown people in data afterwards, and the respondents get caught up in long questionnaires. And again, what Joe and his team have done is really have been able to boil down to the bare essence and have a lot of data and validity studies to show that these are the questions that represent those competencies most effectively. So the 16 competencies, for example, only have about 3 questions per competency. So there's only 48 questions that will then pull out the competencies for each individual.
Okay, and then just on question number 4, Jennifer just wanted to know if the CCDC was similar to FYI. Do you know?
No, I went over that quickly. It was one of those acronyms that snuck in that I probably should have printed out or written out. It's Competency Companion Development Guide. The last one was a G. I think, but I look back at the slide, I'm pretty sure it said G. But yeah, it's the heart of what all of this research has led to is those cross-competency, the little bubbles diagrams that I showed with the competency at the middle and then the cross-competencies around the outside. That's their competency development guide. Those are taken from that.
Okay, and then just going over question number 5 in terms of tools that are effective. A few people mentioned, I think what was effective was when something was either tracked or there were measurable goals that had to be followed up on. So one person mentioned having projects tracked weekly, and someone else mentioned mandatory application activities, and follow-ups seem to be how to make it happen.
Yeah, well, and those are good points, and that's some of what that research that I went through was showing, that where there's some kind of follow-through activity, and those are some examples, it's going to be a much higher takeaway and a much higher application. The problem so often is, and I've been in the same situation where I've been hired to come in and do a one-off workshop or maybe a couple of days or maybe even a few days spread out over time, but it's, well, I've heard it called the spray and pray approach, where you just throw the training out there and individuals enjoy the training, find it very useful at the time, but then they go back to their jobs and there's really no follow through on the part of their boss, the part of the organization. There's no consequence, accountability, reinforcement. There's really nothing more that happens, and that's where you have that huge drop-off that we looked at.
Okay, and Brian had a fun model that is a nice alliteration, which I always like, called, he calls it the 4M approach, and motivators, which are both intrinsic and extrinsic, models, which are available and accessible, mentors to help people over their speed bumps, and mastery, which is focused on real-world experience that builds on strengths and includes feedback. So that was another
way of
tackling it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
So I think we've gone over by 10 minutes, so I guess we can just ask if there are any final questions from the audience. And if not, I'd say thanks, Jim. That was a fun little bus tour. Fast, fun.
Well, yes, it was a fast tour, and we covered a lot of territory. So there's lots more information we can follow through with after this. So hopefully we've got a few more people recruited. It sounds like there's some people in the rebellion already, the strengths-based leadership revolution. So hopefully we can more to focus in on what's right and how we can get more of what's right and build on the strengths and help people increase confidence and increase their effectiveness.
Well, lots of thank yous from the audience coming through the chat box there, Jim. And on behalf of everyone, I'd like to thank you for participating today.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thanks to all the participants. Have a great day.